So this neural manifold is the concept that some people use. Did somebody say something? I didn't hear that.
I don't think so.
Okay, so I'll first introduce the idea, and I'll use this sort of as a roadmap. These many of these points are very short. Don't worry. So first, so what's going on here? I would actually say that ultimately this whole direction is caused by the fact that people can now routinely record from a lot of neurons, hundreds, while in behaving animals. And ultimately, they have the problem what to do with that data, right? The classical tuning curve coding analysis is then very tedious and difficult, and also doesn't really capture what happens when, with simultaneous, the correlations between neurons, the simultaneous recording of the neurons. In the past, people would achieve these kind of neuron numbers by recording in different sessions, so not simultaneously recording. So that has a long tradition from 20 years on. This problem arose, and I was myself confronted with that when I worked in Marseille with Alex Arile, who was aiming at looking at correlations as well. So I'll take two case studies to illustrate this. So in the motor domain, Churchin's group at Stanford has done a lot of this work. And then I'll refer to the study of Xi et al. I forgot the name of the lab. It's a science paper who do prefrontal cortex, and the methods are particularly easy to understand, so I'll refer to that. And so in these studies, you have a simple neural data matrix where you have a large number of neurons, or hundreds, and there's some measure of neural activation. Sometimes it's spike rates. The Xi et al. Study actually uses two-photon imaging, and so it's some kind of continuous activation variable. In other cases, it's spike rates averaged and so on. And so that's the variables. You have, the n is the number of neurons, so this would be the rows here of this matrix. And the other dimension of the matrix are whatever behavioral conditions that you use when you record these neurons. So the task can be time in movement cases, stimuli, task, and so on. And then the notion is that this matrix is very redundant. It has low rank, so that effectively the activation of different neurons co-varies across these different conditions. So this is from a paper here. You may get rid of that bar. I don't know if you, yeah, can put this bar here. Um, so there's an example where in the neural space, this would be the high-dimensional neural space, you might have some changes here. The colors and the time courses reflect some different conditions. And then the notion would be kind of with the naked eye, would see here that a lot of these neurons co-vary so that you could represent in a principal component analysis, for instance, here on the right, the different the state of all these neurons, and that in reality only a handful here, three principal components might explain all the neural data. So these components would be directions in the space of neurons that would represent fairly what happens in the neural data. And so this would be a linear space, and people talk about manifolds because it often turns out that um, that they don't fill that space, or not any space is possible. So here's an example from this motor area where there would be, for instance, closed curves that are you know traced by the neural activity in a representation like that. This would be the PCs here, and then the neural activation would lie in a one-dimensional manifold embedded in a two-dimensional space. So that's where the word manifold comes from. And then an effort is to link this to the notion of disentangled latent spaces. So it's the hypothesis that these low-dimensional spaces are objects like that, latent, there's a typo here. These are notions from machine learning. In machine learning, latent spaces result from various kind of manipulations, essentially some kind of data compression. For instance, you have a high-dimensional data, an image, you encode it and you compress the data by just having a limited number of neurons in a deep network, for instance, and then you decode it. This would be autoencoding, and there can be other chance where you do that. And this compression leads to this space here being lower dimensional. and it is done in machine learning to enable generalization. So force the system to get rid of the uh, variant part that doesn't support generalization. Disentangling, it's actually a concept that is still being debated in machine learning literature. There's a whole different set of methods of how you can try to do that. Um, yeah, I just read that comment. Good. Thank you, Elvina. Um, sorry. Uh, So roughly, it means that the different dimensions that are detectable here encode also different dimensions in the task and the world, the world or the task or whatever it is, the stimulus space. And that is brought about by particular learning techniques. So that's the background of these concepts. And you'll see that in this neural data analysis, the way that these what they mean by disentangled latent space is something very handmade, very, very, artisanal, and very, very simple. Okay, so that's the general notion. Now, I thought it was useful to first discuss generally the dimensional reduction, and then we'll look at the two case studies where we can make that concrete. So again, this was the picture of the neural data, right? You have a lot of neurons and maybe a lot of conditions. And the dimensionality reduction amounts really just to assuming that in this, or testing if in this data matrix, a lot of the rows are linearly dependent, so that the rank of this matrix is much smaller than the number of neurons here. And and you can do this in various techniques. So ultimately, that mathematically amounts to using an ansatz like this, where a small number of latent dimensions are imposed. You can do this by principal component analysis, non-negative matrix factorization, a whole bunch of methods that are being used. And so you're essentially minimizing this error when you're determining these weights here. So these weights, these are essentially directions in the neural space. Along this axis, it's neurons, and you have a few columns like that. So this would be each would be a direction in the neural space. I'll refer to this often as PCs because most of the papers I looked at use some variant of principal component analysis. In other work, they call it factors or latent dimensions, or they call these column spaces vectors. And so what you now have is that you only need to know the dependence of the principal components on the conditions S or on time or whatever that is. That's the compression, right? Rather than know the time courses of all the neurons. Or in other words, you could predict the time course or condition dependence of all neurons from just knowing how these principal components or factors depend on the conditions. Okay, that's the general idea. Good. So let's look at this prefrontal cortex study. This is a recent study in Science. And so the task is that the monkey looks at a display in which a serial order is being presented. So a target shows up first in one location, another location, a third location. It's never the same location, so it's a random selection of the next location without repetition. And then there is a delay imposed that varies in duration. And then the monkey responds by making saccades to the targets in the serial order required. That's a well-known task. There's actually neural recordings about that task have been done for many years. And the new thing is that they now have so many neurons. So here's an example of two neurons that respond here. It's actually using this two photon imagery. So this is the signal you get from that. That's a sort of change in the signal from this optical method over the background. And so here's, for example, here the shadowed time period is the delay that is actually going to be analyzed in most of this data. They're all analyzed in this delay interval, and it's the second part of the delay interval where that's reproducible, right? That they are using here they're using a variable delay to make it not predictable, and so they're taking the shared time interval for this analysis. So the gray shaded area here. You see here, one neuron, for instance, is tuned in the conventional sense. The colors are different targets, and this neuron responds to one particular target, target number two, when it comes first, and then it isn't so strongly tuned to anything for the second and the third slot. So it would be representing both the rank is here the serial order, both the rank and the target, and others are a little less clear, even though you can see here's a preference for the third target, the green one, when it comes second. And I'll show you other tuning curves later. So I have a lot of neurons that you record from. Now, the technique that they use to analyze this data in this new way is using a particular encoding scheme. So they represent the condition in a one hot matrix. One hot, this would be our kind of space code, right? Where it's just normalized here. That is, when you're having a sequence, you're encoding the first rank here by having an entry at the fifth location. Like if it's five, the fifth would have an entry of one. And then the second condition, the second row, you would have a one here at three, and then the third rank ordinal position would be represented here by having a one at the first. So this is like a space code representation where you would have rank or ordinal position as one dimension, and the spatial location of the target L, supposed to be an L here, as the second dimension. For practical purposes, they contract that into a vector under some conditions. That's then an 18-dimensional vector. There's a mistake in the paper that they confuse that, but it's really 18 dimensions, while the number of samples that they take for these 18-dimensional objects are the different combinations that you can have. So the first rank has 6 choices, the second has 5 choices, the third has 4 choices because you don't repeat. So you have 120 samples of this 18-dimensional task vector. And what they do now is that they regress the activity of a particular neuron A. It's, also have repetitions of trials. I'm glossing over that. So this is the 18, each neuron has an activity in all the different conditions, and you're regressing it with with this encoding of the condition. So these beta are the regression coefficients that have, specific for that neuron I, and that, sum here over R and L, that together account for the neural activity recorded under these different conditions. So you could think of this beta as something like a tuning curve in a way, in this space here, representing this kind of space. And there's some technical thing, but they do some normalization and so on, and glossing over all of that. And so now they're using these correlation coefficients as the
Hey,
representation.
Gregor,
Yes,
L is the target location, right?
yes, yeah, the target location. Sorry, I actually had that
Yeah, that's right.
L here,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. And so now the beta are essentially now the representations of the neural activation. So this is sort of like a DPA, by the way. It's somewhat similar in idea. And now they are analyzing the 3 ranks or the 3 ordinal positions separately. So for each, they get a matrix. For one neuron, 3 matrices where ranks 1, 2, and 3. So these are matrices that now have that shape, right? This number of neurons, and then the target L is the dimension. So it's only 6 entries here along the horizontal. So this is actually a somewhat tall matrix, and the neurons are hundreds. And now they do simply principal component analysis. Again, there's some technical things about that, but roughly speaking, it's principal component, and they're actually only using the top 2 PCs. And they do some analysis, how much variance that accounts for, and all of that. There is a lot of technical stuff in that paper. They have a lot of, we looked at the supplementary material that explains all that. So if the original matrix is this tallish matrix, now you have only 2 columns along the neurons. So these 2 columns are the 2 directions in neural space. And then what you now need to know is how these 2 PCs account for all the different targets. So you could think of these columns as spanning the latent space. Now, in the neural space, there are some directions of the latent space. And then the dependence of these 2 the amplitudes of these two PCs. They are called this in the figures after some normalization. They call this RPC1, RPC2 as a function of the target L. That's what they call the latent representation of the target, by these two numbers. So if you visualize that, it turns out that reflects the topology of the targets. In the targets lie in 2D. That's why they chose, to have the two PCs. So it's really sort of in that target space. And the topology, here by the color code, you see target number one is here, target number two, three. So the neighborhood relationships are correctly represented in this latent space. Yeah. So each point is the amplitude of the two PCs you need. I'll come back to that in a moment. When they compare for the different rank, they was analyzed separately, so they get different latent space vectors. So these RPCs refer to different directions in neural space for these three rank. And what they actually find is that if they compare the latent space at one rank with the latent space at another rank, this is a comparison 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 1 to 3, then they tend to be somewhat orthogonal to each other, so near 90 degrees compared to some control. This is why they call them disentangled, because they really represent the rank separately. This is to be taken with a grain of salt, I would say, because when you have a large number of dimensions, then vectors tend to be orthogonal to each other. So that's why this control is, so there's some technicalities about that, but roughly speaking, that is their result and their claim. So that in that sense, this is what they call the disentangled latent representation of that serial order task by these prefrontal cortical neurons.
Gregor,
Yes,
can I ask a question?
yes, please.
I'm just curious if they discuss, any kind of warping of the physical space in the neural representation, or do they consider this to be sufficiently vertical?
Warping, you mean that there will be some kind
Yeah,
of curvature or something? So
yeah.
this paper doesn't do that. These motor papers tend to do that, but here they don't do that. I think that's because the latent, you see, they have only these 6 samples, right? They say it's a space, but in reality, they only have these 6 samples to span that space. So it would be probably difficult to do a nonlinear. So if you were to do a real manifold approximation, you would have to use nonlinear methods of dimension reduction, and there are some methods for that, but I don't think they would work if you have so few samples.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
The motor guys have time, which is much higher dimensional as the thing that samples. So let's look at the motor example. This is where some of this started. I don't know exactly who started this, but I think Churchland's group was sort of like maybe one of the first groups to do that. They have a slightly different story they tell, but I'll just look at this one aspect. So this is, there's a bunch of studies. I'm referring to some of the earlier ones here, where essentially the monkey is doing point-to-point movements. It varies here. In this study, there are 4 monkeys, and some perform relatively straight movements, and others actually have to go, through around obstacles, and so have to have curved movements. But they're planar movements or the targets lie in a plane. Let's put it this way. I think they are planar, even though I think the monkey can actually lift off while they move. I don't remember exactly if they are. I think they are going from the touchscreen to the touchscreen, but they can lift off. So they're not actually planar. But they are, as we know, these kind of movements of the hand in space are very simple, are very regular. So in these trials, there is an instruction period when the monkey learns which target to touch or from where to go, and then there's a delay, and then the recording you will see starts when they're from. In fact, you will see the time structure in a moment. So these are separate reaches. So in the different experiments, so again, different for the different monkeys, there are between 27 and 108 different kinds of movements that they require. They call these conditions. And then the other aspect is that there is time, right? The movement time. They're taking about so look at the time structure of the neural firing around one single movement. It's a little more than the movement because you have this period when the monkey prepares the movement. It's also part of the time structure. So it's about 1.5 times the actual movement duration that they look at. And there are repetitions here. They're averaging across repetitions in order to have firing rates. The neurons fire. And in a single trial, there wouldn't be a lot of noise. And then across trials, you can get a smooth estimate of firing rate. Here's some examples of some different cells in different monkeys. This is the time structure. You see the target is shown here at this point, and that's when different conditions differ from each other. And movement onset is here. You see a lot of these neurons are active before the movement is initiated, but there's also some activity after the movement is initiated, and then it peters out at some point. There's some criterion of how they fix this interval in which they analyze the data. The colors here are just sort of a post hoc thing where they are essentially coloring neurons that are more active before the movement starts. And unless you can, the red ones are the ones that fire more in this preparatory period, then you can see that how they fire in the movement period. So that's just for some of their questions, how they ask us. So they consider these time structures to be some form of rhythmic movement, even though, it's a single episode and then a new episode starts. So sometimes we have one time, one excursion, sometimes two, like use one, and then in these cases there are two. They call these oscillations. It's also a jargon that we use, even though it's a single time structure, but the time structure is well defined. And in other studies, you can see that when you make the movement faster, that it varies, this time structure. That's what they call these oscillations that we'll be looking at. So they're periodic only if you chain the different movements or consider the different movements to be continuously performed. So the way they analyze the data is that they, again, have the number of neurons as the rows of the activity matrix, these average firing rates. And then along the horizontal, in the typical way of these movement guides, they confound, I would say, the conditions, the different movements with time. So they just concatenate that. I hate that, but that is very often done in this literature. So it's not just pure time, it's time across all the different conditions. So it's a very longish matrix that has a lot of data here on the right. That's a bit crazy, but that's very common there. So they decompress that, reduce the dimensionality with a technique they call that JPCA, which is a variant of PCA with some special stuff that I'll gloss over. So they are actually imposing that there are only 6 PCs here. And again, they study how much variance is accounted for. And 6 is good. And later they actually project that onto just 2. So there are 6 columns here. There are the 6 directions in neural space. And so you need to now know the time course and condition dependence for these 6 numbers. That's a much compressed compared to these hundreds of neurons, right? But in depth, of course, is still a large matrix. Here's an example of what the sort of thing that they see, and they're all into these rotations. So these movements this is just two of these PCs here. And then you can sort of see that there is a rotation here. And again, one of the green part, I think, or the red, I don't remember. One of those two happens before the movement is initiated, and the other is after the movement is initiated. And there's a lot of interest in that. So in reality, this would be a 6-dimensional space, and they do find that the movements lie on a submanifold of that. And they have a whole story about finding a projection onto a low-dimensional space so that these lines don't cross. And that's what they call disentangling. And I'm actually not so convinced that that's very deep. This is an ad hoc way of doing that. So they call this now disentangled. And what's really disentangled is this space and the other 4 dimensions. So take that with a grain of salt. They don't really refer to this in any formal sense. So it's not clear if that sense of disentangling is the same as in machine learning. So there's a lot of work that this group does into the structure of these. They call these neural rotations and so on. They just find that useful. Okay, so that's just the thing that we're talking about. So it's actually not much more than just that, right? And they say it's a manifold really just because, they move here on some curved space within this embedding, right? The embedding is actually a linear space, these PCs, right? Very trivial. See, there's a lot of hype also about calling it manifolds. Yeah. Good. So now I would analyze that a little bit. What does that actually mean? So first of all, does the low dimensionality, what does that really mean? So here, the tasks are really low dimensional in the sense, in the first case, you have just these 18 different components, rank and target, are just two, they are samples of low dimensional spaces. And in the movement case, there is the different movements, which are different by movement direction and amplitude, and some other conditions like obstacles. But we know that movements of the hand are low dimensional. That is, they form simple curves. They are piecewise planar, and they are elliptic. So they can be described by a small number of dimensions. So you could say that the task is low dimensional. And in that sense, the neurons with the dependence of the neurons on these task dimensions can't really be high dimensional. The neurons must covary. So any variation that wouldn't be accounted for by this small number of low dimensions would be essentially noise or some randomness or so. So in a way, I would say the real question cannot be answered this way. The real question would be if you make the task more high dimensional, like in movement, let's say if you make a more complex movement, would the number of dimensions you need to account for the data then increase? It's very difficult to do that in practice. It's very difficult to get monkeys to make more complex kind of trajectories. In general, we make these low dimensional movements. So that's difficult to do. And they are already concatenating all the different targets into the same vector, right? And so you can see even the dependence on different targets is low dimensional, probably because these targets lie in a plane. And it's really just accounted for by movement direction, maybe by amplitude. So that I think is generally a problem. I've studied this a lot in the case of muscles. Same concept has been around in muscles where it's called synergy, when you have a lot of muscle, like 40, 50 muscles around like something like an arm, then people find that the muscle activation also co-varies with in time or across different movements. That's then called a synergy, and you can reduce very analogously, instead of the neurons, you would have muscles. And then also people find, yeah, that they co-vary, but in a way it's not very surprising because the movements are simple, and so how can they not co-vary? So I just put that out there um, to demystify that a little bit, even though it's still a fact. The other question is, what does this particular way of extracting the data, this latent space representation, actually, what kind of representation is it when we look at it this way? And you see what happens here is that you have this high dimensional vector where the neurons fire more or less, right? And along this direction, neural space, you're now at a certain point along the space. So any point here is a particular firing pattern of all the neurons along, where so some neurons fire more or less depending on the direction of that vector. So when you have a whole bunch of neurons firing, you're in one location in the space. So it's not so in a sense it's a rate code. Like if a single neuron was spanning the space. So let's say if the vector was 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, so by some odd chance the vector lies exactly in the direction of one neuron, which would be like a grandmother cell, then this dimension would be the firing of that neuron, right? So in that sense, this is sort of a rate code, right? So it's not that you would just have a activation on top of that space, right? It's really in that space itself, that it's a neural space. So a location in that space is a particular level of firing of all these neurons. In that sense, it's a rate code. Here's an example of that. So here the center point is actually when you take the activity of the neurons um, before the targets are given in this previous period. There's some kind of attention signal to the monkey, and then it looks at the display and waits for the sequence to start, and then you find that the neural vector lies here in the origin of that. Now, which probably means that these neurons are not firing a lot. It's not exactly clear, but so it's not like they're, that you're getting some activation, and you don't have a concept of having no neural firing, right? It's always just localized somewhere in the space. So that's here similar. It's a very similar idea. It's a rate code in that sense, right, where you are here. And so in that sense, it's not a neural field, right? It's not that you have a space and then there's an activation on top of that space. So the latent dimensions are not directly the dimensions of potential neural fields, something that we're asking ourselves. I'll come back to that at the very end. Um, and that's something we're thinking about a bit more. So a little bit, this is with the recurrent neural networks. So I haven't really elaborated that very deeply. I'll just hint at that and sort of also point out the state of the art. This is what we studied a lot in our group, but I don't have a final answer. So what is, where does the low dimension come from? And there is a story being told in theory papers that low rank recurrent neural networks are a possible way to account for this low dimensionality. I think that's a bit unclear, quite unclear what that actually means. So it goes back, or I don't know exactly who the first was, but this Church and group has worked with some theoreticians. This is a paper in Nature Neuroscience 2015, in which they are trying to account for the data. This is an example of that kind of data set here. The monkey makes movements, within this plane. This is part of that data set that I just showed you. Makes movements on different targets. And they have a encoding of the task where different, this input condition reflects which task there is as a time signal when the target is presented. And they feed that into a recurrent neural network that then projects out. And so in this particular study, they are actually recording EMG data in different conditions. And they are trying to predict that EMG data. So they're really doing like a back propagation with some complicated techniques to do that for the RNN, so that they can predict the EMG from that input. And that's the recurrent neural network that does that. And the later papers have sort of elaborated that kind of technology. And that works somewhat. So, for instance, they have a way of, this is kind of very impressionistic. So it's just that somewhere in that recurrent neural network, they find neurons that look like some of the neurons they have. Like there's some neurons like this, and they find in the model a neuron like that. So it's just a cherry picking or, impressionistic modeling like that. So that's where some of these intuitions come from. There's more there, but I would say, for instance, I can say that this group has been very interested in this thing, what these different codes, color codes here represent, that is to understand how some neurons fire before the movement and after the movement. Like this neuron would fire both before the movement and after the movement. I always worry, how is it possible that this neuron fires before the movement starts and then doesn't make the arm move or doesn't activate EMG, and then other, and some neurons only fire during the movement, and some neurons primarily fire in the preparation period. And so they fitted a recurrent neural network in one space that would project out to the EMG, and another that would be what we call the orthogonal space, and a space that does not, which we would call the UCM or null space. And in the model, it turns out, deeply hidden in the methods, it's simply a switch. That is, they have two neural networks, one fitted based on this epoch and one fitted based on that second epoch. And they just switch the weights around. It's sort of crazy, as if you could turn on synapses and turn them off by a go signal or something. That's why I say there's a lot of prominently published work here, but the real meaning of that is still, I would say, still quite open. I would be quite skeptical of some of that work, frankly. It's a bit this interesting thing that these theoreticians are not. Let's say I'm not sure how well each group understands the other. There are more profound theoretical papers here. This Pezon is a preprint. I'm not sure it's published yet. That's quite interesting. And there's this review paper that I attached, or I think it's from that paper. And they ask this more theoretically. So they define this notion of low rank RNN. The notion is old. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with. So it's a way of, this will be an example of a neural network of DFT style, right? The only thing missing here is the resting level. If H is our U, this would be U dot equals minus U. This is the recurrent connectivity, where the S must be some sigmoidal. Actually, am I wrong? It says input here. Maybe I'm wrong here on this one. No, this is the external input. So I think the S must be generated here from other neurons, right? This is some sigmoid applied to neuron J. And so neuron J and neuron I interact in a certain way. In this interaction, this will be our interaction matrix, is a product of two functions. So in the simplest case, there would be just two vectors. So mu would be 1. So d is a small number. Like if d is 1, it would be simply the product of two vectors, so one vector, another vector, that would make a low-rank connectivity matrix. So this would be the recurrent connectivity matrix. This would be an example of a rank 2, where there are two vectors each, and they make a matrix like that. They actually discuss what we would consider a periodic localized connectivity matrix, but they don't really elaborate that. This is from another paper, the illustration, but it's the same kind of idea. So when you can generate the recurrent connectivity from just a limited number of such vectors, they call that low rank. And so so that's just defining that, right? And the notion would be that neural dynamics with low rank recurrent connectivity might generate neural activation patterns that are low rank in the sense that we just looked at, where the time course or the depends on conditions is low rank. This Petzon work is the most interesting in that it establishes a connection between this low rank connectivity and the dimensionality of the space that is being represented, that is being encoded, so what they call a functional similarity. So if two neurons are encode similar stuff, they have like a similar tuning curve in our sense, then they will contribute in a particular way to this connectivity matrix. This requires more study, so I'm just hinting that these guys have been thinking about that, but in my view, at least I don't understand that there's a general theory. In fact, I found in the review paper that I sent you a clear statement that it is unknown whether low-dimensional manifolds arise from low-dimensional connectivity or necessarily. Or whether you can have low-dimensional manifolds in the neural data without that low-dimensional structure in input or recurrent connectivity. So that's really a research agenda. And there's a whole bunch of papers, some of which we studied, that seem to demonstrate that show that under some conditions you do get simple time courses or simple parameter input dependence in the similarity sense from these low-rank networks. But whether that's always the case or whether conversely, if you get low dimensional, it has to be a low dimensional connectivity matrix, that is currently under study. So it's a bit open issue. So Stefan looked at our neural fields and examined whether the solutions from our neural fields are low rank and whether the kernel is low rank. And so the kernel, actually, I'm not sure he studied whether the solutions are low rank. Maybe he can correct me. So if you look at a typical, this would be a Mexican hat, so constant inhibition. If A3 is negative, would be global inhibition. This would be maybe local inhibition and let's say a local excitation, a kernel, and then you're trying to write it as a product of two functions, and there's some basis functions for the f and g, which I don't recall. So you see an illustration how the weights, how much of these functions you need. This is the weight as you vary the number, the d of components, and here's an illustration of these functions. And so so here would be an example where you need quite a lot of these functions. You see that the weight here goes down only like after 10 or more in order to get the kernel right. And this is because this is a narrow kernel. And so when you have a narrow kernel, it essentially means that there isn't a lot of covariation, right? The different neurons really stand for different things. But if you make a broad kernel, then you get away with way fewer. So you could say, broad kernels are really population codes in the sense that the neurons are active for a whole range of values of the underlying dimension, right? We know that the peaks are roughly always have this shape of the kernel, of the width of the kernel. So in that sense, we can sort of map this onto our thinking to say, well, when the fields have broad enough kernels, they are low rank in the jargon of this field. And then they already do population code. If we have narrow kernels, then the fields can go more into something like a labeled line or grandmother cell encoding, which is what we sometimes postulate when we have single neural nodes, right, that stand for something. But it's not so clear what the kernel actually means. So this link between the neural dimension and the neural dynamics is discussed much in these papers, but my understanding it's not actually very clear. So the last point I want to make is to try to look at the same thing just from a radical DFT kind of perspective. So ask, are these manifolds really different from the way we've thought about population code? And I use this example of Xedal where they have a lot of examples in their report so that we can look at that. So let's look at their tuning curves and their and maybe see if we can do a DPA. Yeah, I know Jean-Jean. Good to see you. So first, if we were to do the same thing, let's say we had the data of Xedal, and we would have analyzed this with DFT and DPA, distribution of population activation kind of ideas, we would have looked for tuning curves, right? And so first, we would look at the fact that prefrontal neurons do have spatial tuning curves, receptive fields. That's known. And in fact, their tuning curves, they only have these 6 samples, but their tuning curves are somewhat consistent with that. So this, for instance, are the tuning curves in the sense of neural firing across the 6 locations that lie on the circle. And this is for all neurons which, with respect to rank, fire most for rank 1. And you see that, and you can see that the blue curve is when they're firing in rank 1. And you see that not only that they fire more in rank 1, but you can also see that they have a really nice tuning curve, right? Most of these have a single peak that is localized, would be a good tuning curve in our sense for constructing a population distribution of population representation over the single dimension, the angle in which these targets lie. This is for those who contribute to rank 2, and you can see the orange curve, or what that is. This darker orange is that rank 2 response. You see it's not quite as strong. That is, they also fire for other ranks somewhat. And they also have pretty irregular tuning curves in space. And for the rank 3, it's a similar picture. So rank 2 and 3 are often similar in firing, but again, the spatial shape is not complex. Maybe here's an example of a somewhat complex one. Right. So this suggests, for this particular example, that one could think of these neurons as coding space in a tuning curve sense, and maybe also coding for rank. by this subdivision. With a tuning, it's just three numbers, so the tuning curve for that would be one is larger than the other two, and there were examples where two were larger than the third. So it's along 3 points, it's difficult to have a real tuning. So one could construct a population code in our sense, right? The naive population code just takes the tuning curves would be here in 3 dimensions, or let's say 2 dimensions would be the angular representation of location and the ordinal dimension. You could just take the tuning curves, in the usual way. This would be the linear model where the tuning curve is just essentially fixes the synaptic conditions of the inputs, and then the firing rate makes this a population representation. This kind of idea can be generalized, as we know, in that we know that one can do more than this linear thing. One can actually define. We did this in the past, from Alhagen, who's maybe still here, did a lot of work on that, where you're essentially asking the system to generate a particular population representation, like a peak in our sense, localized activation, over the relevant dimensions, and then you're you're determining the way you combine the different firings to approximate that, right? And that's not inconceivable that that would work. So in a way, that is kind of equivalent, right? There's also population code, or you could say these neural vectors, manifolds, are population code. In fact, the people in this field say that they consider that to be the way to do population code. Would be, however, different if we were to use this method, and again, it would have to be elaborated. This would be different because now you would have really a latent, the dimensions would be constructed as they are in DFT by making these hypotheses about underlying dimensions. And now you would have a true space code there, because now you would have activation on top of that space. So you're not just representing a location in neural space, you're representing how strongly the neurons vote for a particular location in that space. This is but this firing is a vote for something, and that then is a neural field. Then you have actually the possibility to have no peak or go through detection and have all those things. The challenge, which is again related to the dynamics, the challenge is if these tuning curves are complex, then we can't perhaps, or it's a question, can we say that the neurons are close to each other? What we have to do is to sort of construct an interaction between the different abstract firing variables in this field, so that there's local excitation, global inhibition, right, to make the instabilities and the attractors and so on. And if this similarity between the different neurons is complicated, that that's some more complicated functions, and so that we might not be confident that there's a good way to characterize their similarity. Can one actually define an interaction kernel for those neurons that make for our kind of instabilities? The Gerstner paper, this Petson and so on paper, does discuss that, but it doesn't quite get to this question, I believe, unless I misunderstood it. So it's maybe that's an interesting theoretical challenge for us. Okay, so already wrap up. I'll say my conclusion is that this neural manifold view is certainly a new way of analyzing neural population. These disentangled latent dimensions reflect the low dimensional task and stimulus spaces. That's essentially the result, right? The low dimensionality itself is there, and it does reflect these underlying spaces. That's the observation. It could do that in a sense trivially, because it could be induced just by the low dimensionality of the task, even though that dimensionality of the task might be intrinsic to the brain, right? We know that movement behavior is low dimensional. That is, we cannot actually make very complex or very varied kind of movements, and that might mean the neural machinery really is like that. And in a way, feature representations and this sort of stuff that we study in cognition could be of that same nature, that it is essentially feature-based and cannot be so much more complex. So then there could be a similar reason for the low dimensionality. The manifold view leads to this, I called it odd rate code representation. That was what I'm a little unclear about. I mean, I think people like that because it's sort of intuitive. You can make these plots. You have reduced all the neural data to just these simple plots. But I'm not sure if that means much. Now you're in a location somewhere, right? And we know that in the brain, then something else happens. You make a decision, some other population is driven by that. And how does that other population now, how is it sensitive to that location in that space, right? That's where I think this isn't quite right. This kind of rate code representation doesn't sort of relegates the task again to make a decision. Like if you're in the center of that space in the task we looked at versus you're on one of the targets, how do you know that when you're in the center, you're not supposed to move, and when you're further out, then you move? So I'm not sure that that is. So that's the part that's not consistent with DFT. The good thing for me is that this manifold approach has really led to the population doctrine now to be very explicitly embraced. So some people cite this work. There's like 2019 and 21 papers that really fully say that the way neural activity relates to task and behavior is through populations. Something that was in the literature before. We always looked for a few papers that really make that point. Now it's more mainstream, and they use these techniques to do that. I think that the DPA is potentially analogous. It's sort of the same idea. In the DPA picture, you would have this covariation simply because neurons are broadly tuned to whatever these low dimension conditions are, and therefore they co-vary. That leads to the reduction of the ramp, and you have to wonder why you have so many neurons, right? So why this redundancy? And maybe that has to do with them also being engaged in other tasks, and so that's a whole other direction. So I'm personally not so sure that this particular manifold perspective is really provides new insight, at least for us. But it has, I think, what the role it serves, it really sort of is the way of how people embrace the population picture. The link to neurodynamics is really interesting. I mean, what they call neurodynamics. So how time courses or different, like there are some models where they are looking at a decision task and how the activation then switches from one state to another, and they fit that by these recurrent neural networks. It's the part that is not so clear yet, I would say. And so we'll have to continue looking at that. So how these low rank RNA would do something like detection and instabilities and so on, and how DPAs, if they were generated from more complex tuning curves, that could only numerically establish, how that is then connected to all kinds of interactions. That is maybe the interesting challenge for DFT that we might want to come back to.